The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army, the militia, jailers, constables, posse comitatus, and so on. In most cases, there is no free exercise, whatever of the judgment or of the moral sense. But they put themselves on a level with wood and earth and stones, and wooden men can perhaps be manufactured that will serve the purpose as well. Such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt. Yet such as these even are commonly esteemed good citizens. Others, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads, and as they rarely make any moral distinctions, they are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. A very few, as heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers in the great sense, and men, serve the state with their consciences also, and so necessarily resist it for the most part, and they are commonly treated as enemies by it. A wise man will only be useful as a man, and will not submit to be clay and stop a hole to keep the wind away, but leave that office to his dust at least. I am too high born to be propertied, to be secondary at control, or useful serving man and instrument to any sovereign state throughout the world. In the words of Henry David Thoreau.
I respectfully protest our arrest. We were only following orders, nothing more. As a fellow soldier, surely you must understand.
Projected by their egocentricity, tyrants have dominated the pages of history in the quest for hegemony. An untold amount of suffering and bloodshed has manifested with a culturally enforced near unconditional loyalty toward authority by the masses. Can anyone rationally argue that all genocides and mass deaths were not committed by standing armies or police of some form of authority? In other words, organized order followers? What is the chain of command without the chain of obedience? After all, a command is inconsequential if ignored. A yielded result is therefore by them who are most morally culpable in the whole structure.
Moral culpability. What does this mean? The determination of who is ultimately at fault or deserving of blame. Again, this is a legitimate and real concept. There is fault. There is blame. We got to get over this new age nonsense that nobody's at fault, nobody's to blame. You should never say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. That caused a lot of chaos and trauma for other people. You're not to blame. It just happened. No, wrong. The people who did the behavior are to blame. Who carried out the Holocaust in Germany? The people who followed their orders to do it. That's who carried it out. Order followers is the answer. Who carried out the purge of political dissonance in Soviet Russia? Order followers. And they're always in the form of police. Why do you think they call a totalitarian system a police state? Why don't they call it a banker state? How come they don't call it a politician state? What about a lawyer state? How about a judge state? Why not call it any of those things? You want to know why? Because none of those people are ultimately responsible for bringing that condition into manifestation through their behavior. They're the order givers. The order followers carry out their commands and through their behavior make that condition a reality. That's why it's called a police state, because every police state that has ever existed has always been created by police who follow their orders because they don't want to take responsibility and think for themselves and know the difference between right and wrong for themselves like an adult.
Give me the key, please. You'll feel safer with me. Can I just have the key?
The kid is not going to feel safer with
Give the key to somebody, please. Let's do it, somebody.
Look, we can't just give it to anyone.
Since the birth of civilization, tyrannical rulers have plagued mankind. Driven by an insatiable appetite for power, such individuals have done their best to control both the minds and bodies of their subjects. Seen in this light, the history of civilization is very much a history of varying degrees of human enslavement. Especially in the case of more authoritarian regimes, it has been common to assume that the masses are purely victims in their enslavement, unable to mount any form of resistance due to the threat of force wielded by those in power. In the 16th century, the French philosopher Étienne de la Boétie challenged this view in his essay The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. All governments, he argued, including the most tyrannical, can only rule for extended durations if they have the general support of the populace. Not only are those in power vastly outnumbered by those over whom they rule, but governments rely on the subjugated populations to provide them with a continual supply of resources and manpower. If one day enough people refused to obey and stopped surrendering their wealth and property, their oppressors would, in the words of Le Boétie, become naked and undone and as nothing, just as, when the root receives no nourishment, the branch withers and dies. Hence, mass submission to even the most oppressive political regimes is always a voluntary servitude, one based on popular consent. Most animals display a natural instinct to be free. When an attempt is made to capture an animal, it flees in terror or else reacts with fierce aggression. When taken from its natural habitat and placed in captivity, its innate vigor atrophies and is replaced by lethargy and despondency. The successful domestication of a species, therefore, usually requires numerous generations of selective breeding in order to eradicate the animal's instinct to roam and live free. Le Boétie asserts that in human beings this instinct for freedom is especially pronounced. Various social factors, however, have atrophied this natural instinct over time to the point where now the very love of liberty no longer seems natural. One of these factors, according to Le Boétie, is the powerful influence of custom, or in other words, our tendency to become habituated to the social and political conditions we were born into. Just as an animal born in captivity knows nothing of the freedom it lacks and hence does not resist its chains, so too those born into state slavery lack the knowledge of what it means to be free, and thus tend to accept their servitude as if it were natural. When one spends their formative years observing those around them not resisting their oppressors, but accepting them and even adoring them, the effects of custom tend to override the natural instinct for freedom, and submission becomes habitual. This socialization into state slavery is analogous to the story of the ancient king Mithridates, who was said to have habituated himself to poison by drinking small amounts over a long period of time. Like him, writes Le Boétie, we learn to swallow and not to find bitter the venom of servitude. Or as he further explains, it is true that in the beginning men submit under constraint and by force, but those who come after them obey without regret and perform willingly what their predecessors had done because they had to. This is why men born under the yoke and then nourished and reared in slavery are content, without further effort, to live in their native circumstance, unaware of any other state or right, and considering as quite natural the conditions into which they were born. But custom alone does not account for the readiness with which people consent to their servitude, as ruling classes have long known that to maintain power, they must play an active role in engineering consent. Plays, farces, spectacles, gladiators, strange beasts, medals, pictures, writes Le Boétie, and other such opiates, These were for ancient peoples the bait towards slavery, the price of their liberty, the instruments of tyranny. In the modern day, these instruments of tyranny have changed form, but their essence remains the same. The endless supply of mindless diversions provided by the mass media and entertainment industry, the numbing effects of pharmaceutical drugs, and the dramatic farce of political elections all serve to distract the attention of the populace away from the reality of their enslavement. Another tactic for engineering consent used by ancient tyrants was analogous to what we call the welfare state today. Laboiti notes that on select days of the year, ruling classes used to distribute bread, wine, and a little bit of money to their subjects, and soon after those who were content and satiated would cry out, "Long live the king." The fools did not realize, Laboiti writes, that they were merely recovering a portion of their own property, and that their ruler could not have given them what they were receiving without having first taken it from them. But the proverbial bread and circuses are not the only instruments of tyranny, for ruling classes have long attempted to evoke not only the consent, but the adoration and reverence of their subjects by co-opting techniques used by religions to make their authority appear sacred. Myths, rituals, the use of religious and cult symbolism, and the construction of buildings symbolizing power and authority and resembling places of worship have long been used by ruling classes to borrow, in the words of Laboiti, a stray bit of divinity to bolster up their evil ways. Despite the fact that voluntary servitude to a political ruling class has been the norm throughout history, Laboiti does not consider it inevitable that this situation will continue indefinitely.
What civilization is 6 billion people trying to make themselves happy by standing on each other's shoulders and kicking each other's teeth in. It's not a pleasant situation, and yet you can stand back and look at this planet and see that we have the money, the power, the medical understanding, the scientific know-how, the love, and the community to produce the kind of human paradise. But we are led by the least among us, the least intelligent, the least noble, the least visionary. We are led by the least among us, and we do not fight back against the dehumanizing values that are handed down as control icons. This is something, I mean, I don't really want to get off on this tear because it's a lecture in itself, but culture is not your friend. Culture is for other people's convenience and the convenience of various institutions, churches, companies, tax collection schemes, what have you. It is not your friend. It insults you. It disempowers you. It uses and abuses you. None of us are well treated by culture. And yet we glorify, the creative potential of the individual, the rights of the individual. We understand the felt presence of experience is what is most important, but the culture is a perversion. It fetishizes objects, creates consumer mania, it preaches endless forms of false happiness, endless forms of false understanding in the form of swirly religions and silly cults. It invites people to diminish themselves and dehumanize themselves by behaving like machines.
There are times when authority must revert to violence in order to maintain obedience. For there will always be a small minority who refuse to obey the tenets of cultural law. Because of this, authorities employ a constant stream of violence known as law enforcement or police. These are not police in the defense of liberty, but police in the defense of authority and written laws. Cultures always teach that liberty and authority are one and the same. But the design of police is to wield the weapons of violence in the preservation of authority, not to defend liberty. There are some exceptions, but the overall task of the police force is to preserve authority. If you want the scorn of culture, ask a police officer how wearing a uniform, carrying a badge, and representation of government delegates them rights to interfere with your life and legitimize coercion and violence, even though you may have caused no harm with your actions. How exactly does the theft and violation of rights differ from a common mafia thug when one is a representative of government authority? Culture maintains a death grip upon the nature of humans. How can we aspire to prosperity and wisdom if we are bound by cultural sanctions, indoctrinating into yielding our innate rights and conform in lockstep to an establishment regardless of the immorality of its dictates? With deceit, violence, and coercion, the chain of obedience called government is largely compelling mass obedience toward policies and agendas of a malevolent oligarchy. Again, society is structured and confined by the sanctions of cultural taboos that crush the attempt to question conspiring factions, let alone the legitimacy of authority altogether. Through silent consent, we allow dangerous power into the hands of evil people, and thus they hold the lever of culture through the prescription of media. Indeed, with silent consent, we've surrendered our liberties in fear of losing our security, eventuating in the loss of both, while indulging in consumerism of useless products that perpetuate cultural society and decay our capacity to think for ourselves.
Conspiracy theories.
The conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theory. Conspiracy.
Conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theorists.
The weird conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theorist.
Conspiracy theories.
Absurd theories.
The target of wild screwball conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theory.
Conspiracy theorists.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news. Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
The first thing to change when one cultural force overcomes another and takes over a society is language. When people's way of describing things is controlled, their way of dealing with them is controlled. Like linguistic spells that associate terms with lunacy, labels such as, quote, conspiracy theory have become habitual in the face of questioning the legitimacy of the official narrative. The media effectively conceal and marginalize truths with labels such as, quote, conspiracy theory or, quote, fake news. We live in the age of technocracy. It is widely known by the psychological architects of the establishment that the bulk of the population will yield their common sense by worship of the experts. Thus, purchasable expert opinion and data to back up a narrative is a common practice to lull the masses back into a slumber by relabeling, discrediting, and associating any threat to the official propaganda with hoax and lunacy. For some, parroting the pathetic mantra of, quote, conspiracy theory is an excuse to circumvent the potentiality of responsibility, and for others, the knee-jerk reaction is because the illusion that accords them security and their identity is criticized. Although, collectively all are instrumental in the colossal effort to censor the emerging truth. Granted, there will always be minority groups that have bizarre beliefs and theories. However, these beliefs are commonly rejected because they contradict common logic. To associate verifiable truths by organizations and/or individuals with such by claiming that they are looking for psychological fulfillment with simple explanations for complex problems is not only criminal, it is dangerous. Such trickery allows evil to run rampant in darkness. Insanity is not an inability to perceive reality. It is a willing rejection of reality in favor of the artificial constructs of tyranny. Cultural indoctrination and blind obedience to media is insanity.
say, David Hume, who was one of the great founders of classical liberalism, a great philosopher, but he wrote a book that he called, I think it was called The Foundations of the Theory of Government or something like that. And in it, he poses a kind of a paradox. He says in every society, whether it's, the feudal dictatorship, military dictatorship, semi-parliamentary system like England, whatever it is, he says power is always in the hands of the governed, those who are being ruled. Power is always in their hands. So how come they just don't overthrow the rulers and take things for themselves? He says, well, the secret, he says, always, every society is control of opinion and attitudes. If you can convince people, if the powerful can convince people, you have to stay in your slot. That's where you belong. And that's your role in life. There's nothing to be changed. Then the rulers can control them. And you take a look at the history of revolutions, significant changes. It's when people broke out of that.
Many are increasingly struggling to adapt to the complexifying artificial constructs and beginning to question the legitimacy of the many aspects of authority, especially the violent approach by governments that are supplementing failing cultural reinforcements. The control of speech must increasingly be disobeyed at all costs for the evil reinforcements of culture to decay. On the contrary, subservience to such evil will usher a highly sophisticated technological social system of servitude, followed by complete planetary demise that is catalyzed by the industrial fossil fuel complex. This is an inevitability that both civil society and the law enforcement must comprehend and stop contributing to the mode of duality that is granting opportunities for the media to obfuscate plain truths. Like the prescription of media, no drug in history has so quickly or completely isolated the entire culture of its users from contact with reality, and no drug in history has so completely succeeded in remaking in its own image the values of the culture that it has infected. Think about it. A global commercial media system dominated by a small number of super powerful, mostly US-based transnational media corporations are a spectre haunting the world. It is a system that works to advance the cause of the global market and promote commercial values, while denigrating honest journalism and values not conducive to the immediate bottom line or long-run corporate interests. Beginning in the 1980s, pressure from the IMF, World Bank, and the US government to deregulate and privatize media and communication systems gave rise to the transnational media giants, and ultimately the concentration of power to deliver and propagate a uniform narrative.
Another wild day on Wall Street.
The deadly new terror attack.
Oil prices continue economy to fall. Shows signs of sustained strength.
Globally, masses have aligned their virtues with the rubbish permeated by mass media, resulting in the erosion of genuine independent thinking, morality, and the human spirit. The deprivation of good input and truth have moulded uniform, demoralized machines that even at self-evident realities reject such in support of tyrannical power structure narratives. Tyranny is disguised as culture and law, and the objective of it is to enslave the minds of people by creating a culture of obedience. On this trajectory, the human race is poised to self-destruct and take the planet down with it. Thus, the culture of obedience is at the very least suicide.
No grades at stake, gentlemen. Just take a stroll. There it is. I don't know left, left, right, left, 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 right, left, left, out! Thank you, gentlemen. If you notice, everyone started off with their own stride, their own pace. Mr. Pitts, taking his time. He knew he'll get there one day. Mr. Cameron, you could see him thinking, is this right? It might be right, it might be right. I know that, maybe not, I don't know. Mr. Overstreet, driven by a deeper force. Yes. We know that, all right. And I didn't bring them up here to ridicule them. I brought them up here to illustrate the point of conformity, the difficulty in maintaining your own beliefs in the face of others. Now, those of you, I see the look in your eyes like,
I would have walked differently. Well, ask yourselves why you were clapping.
and we all have a great need for acceptance. But you must trust that your beliefs are unique, your own, even though others may think them odd or unpopular, even though the herd may go, that's bad. Robert Frost said, 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. I want you to find your own walk right now, your own way of striding, pacing, any direction, anything you want, whether it's proud, whether it's silly, anything. Gentlemen, the courtyard is yours. You don't have to perform, just make it for yourself. Mr. Dalton, you'll be joining us.
Exercising the right not to walk.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Just illustrated the point. Swim against the stream.
Conformity ensures uniformity, and uniformity reinforces conformity. This is a dangerous feedback loop that grants supremacy of authority over humanity. The forces of conformity have been strong throughout recorded human history. Why? Do we have an inborn requirement for approval, hence conforming to trends and popular narratives? Or is it the fear of violence and death, or a combination of both perhaps? There are numerous deep-rooted forces behind the tendency to conform that need to be uprooted. Let's consider one. The highest form of cultural propriety is to obey law regardless of what it says. In order to maintain obedience, culture demands that everyone it enslaves enforce its will upon those around them. It teaches people to call the recalcitrant individuals in their social realm weird or insane. It demands that every person turn on those who fail to obey the precepts of culture. Culture condemns as immoral and antisocial all those who fail to obey its precepts. Hence why the masses deem themselves virtuous by compliance to the dictates of authority, despite the draconian nature and despite the contradiction with morality and logic. Nonconformists are rejected by culture because they plant seeds of doubt into the minds of the conformists regarding the significance of their social role, thus the significance of their very existence, and in doing so, shaking the foundations of the whole establishment. Therefore, the masses loyal to the establishment actively discourage the cultivation of one's uniqueness, ridicule and ostracize nonconformists, and try to pressure them back into conformity. Something they feel compelled to do, given their existential significance is on the line. The point is, culture is a largely overlooked aspect as to one of the main forces behind conformity. What is it going to take to dissolve our egos and suspend judgment so we may engage in serious self-evaluation and self-correction? What will it take to deeply consider the cost of conformity to a destructive machine and what it means to be a part of the problem that is ultimately going to destroy all life on Earth? A fulfilling life is one that sees the flowering of one's uniqueness, not the mimicking of the crowd. Uniqueness is something to be cultivated, not something to be shunned. Uniformity should be shunned. Conformity should be shunned. Statist and especially technocratic status ideology should be shattered. An increasing number of people are experiencing the nagging feeling that there is more to life than just a social role, whereby many are beginning to come away from the hypnotic state they were in, with the realization that they are not living life as it was intended to be. Authority is artificial. It is a mechanism that can be written in textbooks. Humans are an organism, a complexity that transcends the textbook. The distinction between the two are like trying to force a square peg through a round hole, where the friction of which is manifesting as omnicide. How long will we remain ignorant of the reality and significance of universal laws that we collectively contradict with the way we exist and think? Sacrificing our labour and vigour for the benefit of oligarchs that perceive themselves as masters, that determine our limit of freedom to think, speak and act, which ultimately amounts to tyranny. Tyranny that is disguised as culture and law that we conform to. This voluntary servitude can end abruptly. In the words of Etienne de la Boétie, from all these indignities, such as the very beasts of the field would not endure, you can deliver yourself if you try, not by taking action, but merely by willing to be free. Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break into pieces.
This is the moment of which it is said man's extremity is God's opportunity. Because we have to stop. And when we stop, we find a world that is happening rather than being done, being shoved. And that happening, as distinct from doing, is our fundamental self. And our fundamental self is not something just inside the skin. It's everything around us with which we connect. When you look out of your eyes at nature happening out there, you're looking at you. I'm not going to say what we should do from then on, but simply that before we think of doing anything in this critical situation, we realize the completely illusory nature of the beings that we think we are, and get back again to the beings that we really are, which includes all this outside world, no longer left outside.
No baby is born good or bad. One's mind is nurtured or corrupted by his or her environment, be it family, society, or culture. Given the right circumstances and our capacity to perceive, who is to say that living in accordance with nature and universal laws will not yield the blossoming of exponential wisdom, where the interdependency of everything in life is a common understanding, and the appreciation toward the deeper mysteries of life are a commonality, where virtue and fellowship is ingrained into our upbringing, so each may pursue their true authenticity. We are but a tiny feature of the entire body of nature, so listen to the nature within yourself and surrender to its call.